There are stories that shake us from within, not because they are loud or violent, but because they remind us of a truth too long ignored. Imagine walking into your old high school after more than 20 years, only to find the man who once slipped food into your locker still bending his back at 80 years old. Moppe in hand, shoulders weary, eyes still kind. This was the moment that met Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett when she returned to Clara Barton High. It was not a campaign stop. It was not a photo opportunity. It was a reckoning with memory, with dignity, and with justice. The school itself had not changed much. The cracked parking lot, the faded gas station nearby, on the church where she once learned to raise her voice, they stood like monuments to a past that refused to leave. For Jasmine, each wall carried an echo. She could hear her younger self rushing to class with second-hand books in her bag, a stubborn streak in her walk, and dreams that no one around her fully understood. Yet, standing in those halls again, she also felt the weight of what had been missing, the absence of recognition for the people who had made survival possible. The man she found was Mr. Leonard Traylor, a custodian who had worked the same hallways for over half a century. To many students, he was invisible, just another figure blending into the beige walls and squeaky floors. But to Jasmine, he was the quiet anchor who had once kept her afloat when life threatened to pull her under. In the years when her mother worked double shifts and bills piled high, it was Mr. Traylor who noticed her exhaustion and slipped her a cup of tea. When her registration was lost before the SATs, it was Mr. Traylor who quietly fixed the form. When she sat shivering on the stairwell because the heater at home had failed, it was Mr. Traylor who brought her a small heater from the supply closet. He did not give speeches. He did not demand recognition, but his quiet acts of respect stitched together the fragile fabric of her youth. For Jasmine, the sight of him still at work was not just shocking, it was unbearable. How could a man who had given so much still be forced to carry a mop at 80 years old? How could a system that claimed to value education fail to care for the very workers who kept its doors open? It was a mirror held up to America's conscience, the country that celebrated freedom yet forgot the hands that cleaned its classrooms. The injustice was not unique to him. Across the South and across the nation, thousands of black men and women had worked in schools for decades with little pay, few benefits, and no retirement security. They were the unseen backbone, the ones who arrived before the first bell and left long after the last bus. Their labor was treated as expendable, their dignity as optional. Mr. Traylor was just one name, one face, in a long line of forgotten heroes. But on that September afternoon, Jasmine Crockett decided that his name would not be forgotten. She had returned to her high school simply to attend an anniversary event. But the journey became something much larger. It became a confrontation with the questions that haunt every generation of Black Americans. Who sees us when we are silent? Who honors us when our bodies grow tired? Who carries our legacy forward when the world pretends not to notice? This story is not only about Shreveport, Louisiana. It is about Harlem and Montgomery. It is about the dusty roads of Mississippi and the crowded buses of Atlanta. It is about every black worker who built schools, cleaned streets, raised other people's children, but was told their work was worth less than the titles on office doors. It is about us, about the dignity our parents fought for, the justice our ancestors prayed for, and the recognition too often denied to those whose hands made everything possible. So stay with us, because this is not just another story. It is the future our ancestors dreamed of. It is the question that still burns in the hearts of our people. Will America ever learn to see the quiet heroes who hold it together? Stay with us. Subscribe and walk with us, because a black voice that tells the truth should never again be silenced. The roots of this story reach deeper than one woman returning home or one man still carrying a mop. To understand the weight of what Jasmine Crockett felt when she saw Mr. Leonard trailer in those hallways, we must go back to the soil of Shreveport, Louisiana, a city carved by history, marked by contradictions, and shaped by the struggles of black families seeking dignity in a world that often denied it. Shreveport was not a place of glamour. It was an industrial town, a patchwork of working-class neighborhoods, Baptist churches, and the echoes of a long history of racial segregation. In the mid-20th century, black residents were confined to the margins of opportunity, their schools underfunded, their streets neglected, their futures treated as expendable. Yet, even in the face of systemic neglect, they built communities of strength. They built networks of care, often invisible to the outside world, where elders looked after children, where neighbors fed one another, and where custodians like Leonard Traylor quietly held up the walls of schools that were never truly built for them. By the time Jasmine Crockett was born, these patterns had not disappeared. They had simply taken new shapes. The textbooks at Clara Barton High were often secondhand, passed down from wealthier, wider districts. The resources were limited, the buildings worn, but the hunger of the students could not be contained. Jasmine herself was a child of both hope and hardship. Her mother worked long hours at the hospital, often too tired to rest, but always determined that her daughter would not be defined by limitation. It was within this context that Mr. Traylor's presence mattered most. He was not a teacher with a degree on the wall. He was not a principal making decisions about budgets. He was a custodian, a man with a mop and a ring of keys, jingling at his side. But in schools like Clara Barton, where children were asked to learn in spite of scarcity, custodians became more than cleaners. They became protectors of dignity. They noticed the children who were too quiet. They stepped in when hunger, exhaustion, or despair threatened to swallow a young life whole. For Jasmine, the memory of Mr. Traylor was not tied to a single event, but to a series of moments that together formed a lifeline. There was the morning when her heater at home broke, and the Louisiana winter bit through her thin coat. She had sat on the stairs, finger stiff, waiting for class to begin. Mr. Traylor had walked past without a word, only to return minutes later with a small space heater from the staff closet. He set it down, gave her a nod, and kept walking. That gesture said more than any speech. It said, "You are seen. You are worth the warmth." There was another day when she nearly missed her chance to sit for the SATs because the office lost her paperwork. The secretary brushed her off, telling her to try again next year. Mr. Traylor overheard, and by the next morning, the form had been corrected. He never told her how. He never claimed credit. But Jasmine knew that without him, her path to Howard University and later to law school might have ended before it began. Such acts were not rare for him. They were the rhythm of his life. He slipped lunch tickets into the hands of children whose parents had lost jobs. He cleaned up messes before others could laugh. He offered words that lingered for decades. Once, when Jasmine was accused of cheating and retreated to the bathroom in tears, Mr. Traylor simply said as he mopped the floor, "Some people will try to count you out because they are afraid of what happens if you get counted in." That sentence, plain and steady, became her armor through law school, through courtrooms, through Congress itself. But beneath these acts lay a larger injustice. Men like Leonard Traylor had given their lives to schools without ever receiving the security that teachers or administrators enjoyed. No pensions, no full health care, no safety nets. Their labor was considered replaceable, their humanity overlooked. The institution survived on their backs, yet rarely acknowledged them. This was the environment in which Jasmine grew up, a world where black excellence was demanded without support, where survival often depended on the kindness of those who had the least to give. Shreveport was a place where history's weight pressed down on every black child. but where resilience was also born in church pews, in kitchen conversations, in the quiet persistence of custodians. For Jasmine, seeing Mr. Traylor still at work decades later was like seeing history frozen in place. It was a reminder that while she had moved forward, carrying titles and victories, he had remained in the same corridors, carrying a mop instead of recognition. It was a reminder that progress for one did not erase injustice for another. And it was the beginning of a question that would haunt her. What does justice look like for those who never stop showing up, even when no one sees them? In this chapter, the stage is set. We see the soil that shaped Jasmine, the custodian who steadied her, and the injustice that still lingers in America's schools. The story of Mr. Traylor is not an isolated tale. It is the story of a system that takes without giving back, of a nation that celebrates the exceptional while ignoring the faithful, and it is within this soil that the seed of Jasmine Crockett's future fight was planted. The invitation had arrived quietly, like so many other envelopes in the postplane. White, unassuming. It was a letter from Clara Barton High School announcing its 40th anniversary celebration. For weeks, it sat unopened in the bottom drawer of Jasmine Crockett's kitchen in Dallas. She noticed it every morning when she reached for her keys, and every evening when she slipped her handbag back. She told herself she was too busy, too consumed by hearings, interviews, and the endless machinery of political life. But deep down, she knew the truth. She was not ready to go back. Shreveport was more than a place. It was memory, contradiction, laughter from childhood friends mixed with sharp reminders of poverty, loss, and the burden of being young, gifted, and black in a world that did not want to see her potential. Every corner carried a fragment of her story, both victories and wounds. Returning meant reopening doors she had long since closed. And yet, one Friday afternoon in September, Jasmine turned the ignition of her car. The drive stretched for 4 hours, long enough to question why she was doing it at all. She passed through small Louisiana towns with rusting signs and weathered porches. The closer she came to Shreveport, the heavier her chest felt. When she pulled into the cracked parking lot of Clara Barton High, the motion struck her. She sat in the car for several minutes, watching. Children with oversized backpacks sprinted toward yellow buses. A group of boys shot hoops on the far end of the court, shouting over one another in their energy. Jasmine saw herself, the girl with second-hand books, a stubborn streak, and dreams too large for the city to hold. She stepped out of the car, heels striking pavement like echoes. Inside, the halls looked unchanged. Bag it was. Squeaky tiles. A bulletin board covered with faded posters. She wandered slowly, pausing at room 212, where Miss Franks once told her that her essays read like courtroom arguments. The memory made her smile, but only for a moment. Then, she heard the slow drag of a mop, the faint clink of a bucket. Turning the corner, Jasmine froze. There he was, Leonard Traylor, in worn navy overalls, still working at 80 years old. His hair had thinned, his back was stooped, but the dignity in his presence remained. For a second she hesitated. Then he looked up, and his face broke into a smile like sunlight. "Well, I'll be," he said. "Jasmine Crockett, still got that same fire in your walk." She laughed, caught between nostalgia and disbelief. "Mr. Traylor, you remember me." "Course I do," he replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "You were always correcting teachers. We knew you were headed somewhere." Their talk began lightly about law school, her years away, her mother's passing. Then Jasmine's voice softened. "I never thought I'd see you still working here. Not at your age." Mr. Traylor leaned on his mop. "Life don't always line up the way you plan. You just keep moving. Keep showing up." Later, they sat outside the cafeteria on a low brick wall. He poured lukewarm tea from a thermos into paper cups. He reminded her that years ago he had slipped tea into her locker when she looked exhausted. She had thought it a secret admirer. He laughed. Nah, just an old man who didn't like seeing good kids burn out before the world gave them a chance. As the sun dipped, he spoke of Josie, his wife, of the illness that insurance would not cover, of savings consumed by bills, of her death. 3 years ago, she used to say, "I'd die pushing this mop." He admitted. Guess she was half right. Jasmine's throat tightened. That's not right. You gave everything to this place, to these kids. That's what grown folks do. He answered gently. We give. We don't wait for thank yous. We just hope it helps someone. That night, Jasmine lay awake at her cousin's home. The ceiling fan spun above. Her laptop glowed beside her. She saw only Mr. Traylor's weary face, his rough hands. The way students had rushed past him without a glance. She remembered the times he had been the only adult to truly see her, not as a statistic, not as a promise, but as a human being. She thought of winters, when the heater failed, and he quietly brought her warmth of the day. Her SAT registration was lost, and he fixed it, of hiding in the bathroom after being accused of cheating, and hearing his quiet words. Some people will try to count you out because they're scared of what happens if you get counted in. Those words had carried her through law school, through courtrooms, through Congress itself. Now, she realized he might have been the first adult who ever believed in her, and he was still working, still giving, still unseen. Restlessness pushed her from bed. She opened her laptop and typed average retirement. Okay, Janitors, Louisiana. Then medical debt among senior citizens. Then how to start a community trust. Each result was another weight on her heart. This was not about charity. It was about justice. By dawn, she had made her decision. She drove back to the school and found him in his storage room, patching a mop head. A gospel tune drifting from a radio. She told him she wanted to help. He smiled knowingly. You always had a fire in you. Jasmine, go ahead and use it. Back in Dallas. She opened GoFundMe. The title read, Help Mr. Traylor Retire with Dignity. She wrote from the heart about the man who had once kept her alive in small, unseen ways, about how it was time to show up for him. She uploaded the old photograph, her sitting against lockers, him sweeping in the background, and pressed publish. At first there was silence, a few donations, a few shares. Then a journalist friend noticed. Then local television. Soon strangers across the country were reading about an 80-year-old janitor in Shreveport who had given everything and received nothing. Within 72 hours, the fund surpassed $40,000. Within a week, it crossed $125,000. What began as a return to an old school had become something far larger. The first spark of a movement, the fundraiser was only the beginning. Jasmine Crockett had thought it might take months, perhaps even a year, to gather enough support for Mr. Leonard Traylor, but the speed of the response stunned even her. Within 1 week, the story had traveled beyond Shreveport, beyond Louisiana, beyond the South. It had become national news. Her phone rang constantly. Journalists wanted interviews. Commentators wanted sound bites. Activists wanted to know how they could help. Some cynics even suggested it was all a political maneuver, a convenient story for a congresswoman to polish her image. Jasmine ignored the noise. She knew the truth. She had not been looking for this fight, but now that he had found her, she was not about to back away. Because this was not just about Mr. Traylor, it was about the entire system. A system that allowed custodians to work for 50 years without secure pensions. A system that told cafeteria workers and bus drivers that their labor was too small to matter, even though nothing could function without them. A system that praised the idea of hard work, but punished those who gave their entire lives to it. Jasmine began to speak more boldly. In church basements, at town halls, on late-night radio programs. She repeated one clear message: justice is not charity. Dignity is not a gift. They are rights, and rights delayed are rights denied. Her words echoed the cadence of the civil rights movement, connecting her cause to a longer struggle. And it resonated. Teachers wrote to her. Nurses, janitors, cafeteria workers all shared their stories of exhaustion, of bills that never ended, of bodies breaking down under years of invisible work. One letter came from a woman in Georgia who had cleaned classrooms for 30 years while raising 4 children alone. I thought no one ever saw us. The letter said, but your story made me cry. You made us visible, but visibility was only the first step. Jasmine understood that stories, as powerful as they were, needed to become policy. So she began drafting proposals with her team: retirement assistance funds, federal grants for schools to create custodial pensions, a platform that would lift those who had always been left at the bottom. The pushback came quickly. Some lawmakers dismissed the idea as unrealistic, too costly. Some pundits on television sneered that not everyone gets to retire comfortably. That is life. Others muttered that focusing on janitors was a distraction from real issues. Jasmine listened, but she did not bend. She had grown up knowing what it meant to be dismissed, to be told her concerns were small, her dreams too heavy. She knew how to fight. The more they tried to belittle the cause, the more determined she became. At a rally in Dallas, she spoke before a crowd of more than 200 people. Behind her, a banner read, "Hallways First." She told them about Mr. Traylor's thermos of lukewarm tea, about the heater he placed beside her on a freezing morning, about the words that carried her through law school. Some people will try to count you out because they are scared of what happens if you get counted in. The crowd grew silent as she spoke. Then they erupted, chanting his name, chanting her name, chanting the word justice. In those moments, Jasmine realized something profound. The story had tapped into a hunger deeper than one man's retirement. It had awakened a longing for recognition that stretched across generations. Black families who had seen their parents work themselves into the grave, immigrants who had scrubbed hotel floors for decades, women who had raised children not their own for little more than survival wages. All of them heard in Mr. Traylor's story the echo of their own, but as the movement grew, so too did the danger. Some lobbyists began to whisper against her. School boards worried about what new obligations might cost them. Opponents tried to paint her as reckless, as chasing sentiment rather than sense. And in the swirl of it all, Jasmine sometimes lay awake at night, wondering if she had the strength to carry it forward. One evening, after a particularly bruising television debate, she returned home, exhausted. She sat in her living room, the city lights of Dallas flickering outside. Her phone buzzed with messages both supportive and cruel. She almost shut it off. But then, she noticed one new text. It was from Mr. Traylor. "Baby," it read, "do not let them make you small. You were never small." The words steadied her. They reminded her of the man whose quiet strength had carried her once, and who was now carrying her still. She smiled, wiped her eyes, and returned to her desk to keep working. As weeks passed, the campaign spread to other states. A superintendent in Ohio reached out. A principal in Missouri wanted guidance. A group of cafeteria workers in Alabama started their own fundraiser, inspired by Mr. Traylor. Suddenly, what began as one woman's act of remembrance was blossoming into a network, a chorus of voices demanding change. For Jasmine, this was the true test of politics. It was not about speeches in marble halls or polished press releases. It was about people, real people, often forgotten, whose lives bore the weight of an unjust system. To fight for them meant entering into conflict, not with malice, but with fire. And so she did. She faced critics in committee hearings. She clashed with pundits on live television. She drafted bill after bill, knowing most would be struck down. But believing that persistence was power, every setback became fuel. Every insult became a reminder that progress was never handed freely. It was fought for, claimed, insisted upon. The fight for Mr. Traylor's dignity had grown into a broader struggle for every quiet worker, every overlooked hero, every soul who had given more than they ever received. And though Jasmine knew the road ahead was long, she also knew this. Once a movement begins, once truth is spoken aloud, it cannot be silenced again. Because dignity, once remembered, is contagious, and justice, once demanded, does not go away. The story of Mr. Leonard Traylor was no longer confined to the walls of Clara Barton High School. It had leapt across state lines, carried by headlines, interviews, and social media shares that multiply like sparks in a dry field. What began as one fundraiser had become something larger, a living flame of recognition for the unseen workers of America. Each morning, Jasmine Crockett awoke to new messages, emails from strangers she had never met, each carrying a piece of their own truth. A retired custodian in Ohio wrote, "I thought I would die in those hallways. Thank you for reminding us that we deserve more than silence." A cafeteria worker in Mississippi wrote of aching knees and unrelenting bills. A bus driver in Alabama told her of the children he carried every day, none of whom would ever know his name. The GoFundMe page became more than a fundraiser. It became a confessional, a public ledger of sacrifice and survival. People wrote in the comments, not only their donations, but their histories. My father scrubbed hotel floors until his hands bled. My mother worked in a school kitchen until cancer took her. This is for all the janitors who held us together when no one else cared. Jasmine read every word. She wept at her desk, at her kitchen table, sometimes even in her car. Between appointments, the stories were not just echoes of Mr. Traylor's life. They were a chorus, a reminder that the nation had built itself on invisible shoulders, and the flame grew. Local churches began holding collections for elderly workers. Teachers' unions added clauses to contracts, demanding fairer retirement packages for custodians and cafeteria staff. Students at universities staged small protests, marching with signs that read, "Dignity is not optional." Television networks seized on the story, some framing it as a feel-good tale of generosity, others as a mirror of America's inequality. Cable news anchors debated policy details, but the image that stuck in the public's mind was simpler: an 80-year-old man with a mop, finally laying it down. Jasmine found herself at the center of this storm. Invitations poured in to appear on national talk shows, to deliver keynote speeches, to meet with lawmakers in Washington. She accepted some, declined others. Her guiding star remained the same. This was not about her. It was about the quiet army of workers who had too long been ignored. Still, she understood that her voice carried weight, and so she used it. On the floor of Congress, she told Mr. Traylor's story with trembling conviction. "We call them custodians, but they are more than that. They are guardians of our schools, protectors of our children, keepers of our dignity. And if this nation cannot care for them in their old age, then what does our greatness mean?" The chamber fell silent. Some rolled their eyes, but others leaned forward, listening. And outside those walls, millions heard her words replayed across the country. But with recognition came resistance. Lobbyists argued that creating pension programs for custodians would drain school budgets. Editorials claimed Jasmine was emotional and impractical. Some even accused her of exploiting Mr. Traylor for political gain. She did not flinch. Instead, she pointed back to the truth. If caring for those who carried us is emotional, she declared at a rally, then I am proud to be emotional. If demanding justice is impractical, then I am proud to be impractical, because silence is not an option. The crowd roared. Momentum built within 2 months. Similar fundraisers had sprung up in more than a dozen states. In Little Rock, a custodian received enough support to retire after 50 years of work. In Atlanta, cafeteria workers launched their own campaign. In Chicago, a group of bus drivers formed a mutual aid fund, citing Mr. Trailer as their inspiration. One evening, Jasmine received an email with a photograph. It showed a school custodian in Missouri, sitting at a lunch table with 2 children. The caption read, "We started the program here, thanks to Mr. Trailer. We see them now." Jasmine printed the photo and kept it on her desk as a reminder. The flame was spreading. Still, she knew fire could be fragile. Public attention burned bright, but often faded fast. Her challenge was to transform the moment into a movement, something that could endure long after the headlines moved on. That meant building structure. With her legal team, she established Hallways First as a formal nonprofit. Its mission was clear: to provide retirement assistance for school support staff across the South. They set up pilot programs in Louisiana and Mississippi. They partnered with unions, churches, and community groups, and slowly, they began to craft a model that could be replicated nationwide. But what mattered most was that people felt seen for the first time. Custodians and cafeteria workers heard leaders speaking their names with respect. For the first time, students looked at them not as background figures, but as pillars of their schools. Jasmine knew that every great movement was born of both outrage and love. Outrage at injustice, and love for those who deserved better. Mr. Trailer's story had awakened both, and now the question was how far it would reach. The answer began to appear in unexpected places. A high school debate team in Detroit chose custodial pensions as their tournament topic. A choir in Atlanta dedicated a concert to school workers. A senator from the Midwest introduced a bill named the Trailer Act, calling for federal grants to support retirement for school custodians. Jasmine smiled at the name. She thought of the man in his storage room, patching a mop head with fishing line. The gospel song drifting through the air. He had never asked for recognition, yet now his name was being spoken in the halls of Congress. The flame had spread farther than she had ever imagined, and it was only the beginning. The brighter the flame burned, the more shadows it cast. For every headline that praised Jasmine Crockett's fight for dignity, another questioned her motives. For every family who thanked her for giving them hope, there was a critic who sneered that she was chasing sentiment rather than substance. At first, she tried to ignore it. She told herself that progress always bred resistance, that criticism was part of the path. But the noise grew louder, more organized. Lobbyists representing private contractors whispered in the ears of school boards, warning that new retirement obligations would cripple budgets. Editorial writers accused Jasmine of turning personal memory into political theater. On talk shows, polished pundits shook their heads. No one doubts her heart. One said, "But this is not realistic. Schools can barely pay their teachers. How does she expect them to fund pensions for janitors?" Another smirked, "It is touching, but at the end of the day, America cannot run on feelings." Jasmine listened to the recordings late at night, the voices echoing in her empty living room. The words cut, not because they surprised her, but because they revealed how deeply invisibility had been normalized. To these voices, Leonard Trailer was not a man who had given 50 years. He was a statistic, an expense line, a burden. The opposition became more pointed. Anonymous emails arrived in her office, warning her to drop the act or risk losing credibility. An online smear campaign suggested she had fabricated parts of Mr. Trailer's story. A blogger even accused her of enriching herself through the fundraiser, an accusation quickly disproven, but damaging all the same. And yet, Jasmine knew the greatest battle was not outside. It was inside. There were nights when exhaustion pressed so heavily she could hardly breathe. Nights when she sat in her car after long hearings, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles ached, whispering to herself, "Why am I doing this? Why not let it go?" But then she would remember the winter morning when Mr. Trailer set a heater beside her freezing hands, the quiet moment outside the cafeteria when he poured lukewarm tea into paper cups, the single sentence that carried her through law school. Some people will try to count you out because they are scared of what happens if you get counted in. And she knew she could not stop. Still, the pressure mounted. At a committee hearing in Washington, she presented a proposal for federal grants to support custodial retirement funds. Half the room shifted uncomfortably. A congressman interrupted her mid-sentence. "With all due respect, Representative Crockett, do you really believe the American taxpayer should foot the bill for custodians who chose low-paying jobs? Personal responsibility has to mean something." The words hung in the air like poison. Jasmine paused, took a deep breath, and steadied her voice. "With all due respect, Congressman, Mr. Leonard Trailer did not choose poverty. He chose service. He chose to show up every single day for 50 years, making sure children had clean classrooms and safe hallways. He gave this country his strength, his health, his very life. And now, you tell me he should be punished for it. No, this nation has a responsibility, not charity. Not pity, a responsibility to honor those who built it quietly, without applause." Her words rang with fire. Some applauded, others rolled their eyes. But no one left that room untouched. Outside the chamber, cameras swarmed. Reporters peppered her with questions. Was this sustainable? Was she overreaching? Could her proposal survive? She answered, each with the same refrain: "Justice is never convenient, but it is always necessary, behind closed doors." Though she felt the strain, her staff worried about burnout. Friends urged her to take breaks. Even family members called, concerned for her health. She smiled, reassured them, then worked late into the night, drafting new plans, writing speeches, reading letters from workers whose lives mirrored Mr. Trailer's. But the greatest test came not from Washington, nor from critics on television. It came from the silence of those she fought for. One evening, Jasmine visited a school in rural Arkansas. She expected gratitude, perhaps hope. Instead, she was met with skepticism. A group of cafeteria workers listened politely to her speech. Then one woman spoke. "We have heard promises before. People come with cameras, with speeches. Then they forget us. How do we know you are different?" The words pierced Jasmine more deeply than any pundit's insult. She stood silent for a long moment, then answered softly, "You do not. Not yet. All I can give you is my word. But I promise you this. I will not forget, not tomorrow, not next year, not when the cameras move on, because I know what it feels like to be forgotten, and I will not let it happen again." The room stayed quiet. Some nodded slowly. Others remained cautious. Jasmine walked away from that meeting, humbled. She realized trust was not given easily, especially to communities long betrayed. It had to be earned, day by day, action by action. That night, she sat alone in her hotel room, staring at the ceiling. Doubt crept in again. Was she enough for this fight? Could she withstand the storm of politics, the weight of expectation, the cruelty of cynics? Her phone buzzed. Another message from Mr. Trailer. "I watched you on the news today. You look tired, but strong. Remember, baby, storms only test the roots. Yours are deep. Do not forget that." She closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and let the words settle. Yes, the storm was fierce. Yes, the trials were many. But roots that had grown in Shreveport soil watered by struggle and steadied by faith, could withstand far more. The battles ahead would be harder still. Lobbyists were sharpening their arguments. Political opponents were preparing campaigns against her. Even allies sometimes faltered, unsure if this fight could be won. But Jasmine Crockett had decided long ago she would not measure her work by convenience or popularity. She would measure it by justice. And justice, though delayed, would come if she refused to let go. The days no longer began with the squeak of a mop bucket or the hollow echo of footsteps in an empty hallway. For the first time in more than 50 years, Leonard Traylor awoke without obligation. The alarm clock still sat on his nightstand, but it no longer rang. He rose when he wished, made tea when he felt like it, and sometimes simply sat in his chair, marveling at the silence. Retirement was not an ending. It was a rediscovery. Yet it felt strange, almost too light after decades of wait. When Jasmine Crockett visited him one golden Sunday afternoon, she found him on his porch, rocking slowly. The newspaper folded and forgotten in his lap. Neighborhood children cycled down the street, their laughter rising above the cicadas' hum. "You getting used to this yet?" Jasmine asked, settling beside him. He chuckled. "Baby, I still wake up at 6 o'clock sharp, heart racing, like I'm late for work. Then I remember, ain't no floors waiting. Freedom is a funny thing. After a lifetime of labor, it takes practice to know what to do with it." Jasmine smiled. She understood. For people like Mr. Traylor, rest had never been given freely. It had to be earned, often at the cost of their health. Now, for the first time, his hours belonged only to him. Inside his modest home, the walls spoke of legacy. Pictures of Josie, his late wife, smiled down from the mantel. Faded family photos lined the hallway. On the kitchen table sat a thick binder Jasmine had given him, filled with hundreds of letters from strangers across the country. He read them often, shaking his head in disbelief. Teachers, nurses, bus drivers, even fellow janitors wrote about how his story had moved them, how it gave them courage to believe their lives, too, had a value. "You know," he said softly, "I spent years thinking I didn't matter, just another man with a mop. Now people call me a hero. I don't know how to carry that." "You don't have to carry it," Jasmine replied. "It carries itself. What you did was never small. The world just wasn't paying attention until now." His eyes glistened. "But you saw it. Even back then, I tried," she whispered, "but I didn't do enough. Not until now." They sat together as the afternoon sun stretched across the street, casting long shadows. For Jasmine, the moment was more than personal. It was proof that justice could be real, not in sweeping costuras, but in one man's ability to breathe without fear of the next shift or unpaid bill. But Mr. Traylor's story did not end with his rest. It became a seed, planted in communities across the South. Hallways first. The initiative Jasmine launched grew faster than she had dared to hope. At first, it provided retirement support for custodians in Louisiana within months. Schools in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia joined. Cafeteria workers began to receive assistance. Bus drivers gained access to healthcare funds. The small spark of one man's dignity began to glow into something larger, even in Washington. The Traylor Act, once dismissed as symbolic, began to gather momentum. Letters poured into congressional offices. Pastors preached about it from pulpits. Teachers invoked it at meetings. Students wrote essays about it. Though progress was slow, the very fact that legislators had to discuss the rights of custodians at all meant something had shifted. For African American communities, especially elders, the story struck deep. They had lived lives where their labor was invisible, their sacrifices ignored. Mr. Traylor became more than one man. He stood for every grandmother who cleaned houses without recognition, every father who worked double shifts on buses, every aunt who ladled soup in school cafeterias. His name became a shorthand for dignity, long denied. In church gatherings across the South, his name was spoken with reverence. In barbershops, his picture was clipped from newspapers and taped to mirrors. In family living rooms, parents told his story to children. That could have been my daddy. People said, that was my mama. One school in Little Rock renamed its annual service award the Leonard Trailer Dignity Prize. Jasmine attended the ceremony. A teenage girl read an essay about her grandmother, a janitor who had died before retirement. She mattered. The girl wrote, "And thanks to Mr. Trailer, I know the world sees her now." The gymnasium erupted in applause. Jasmine's eyes stung with tears. This was legacy, not marble statues or political titles, but seeds planted in young hearts, ready to grow. Yet challenges remained. There were still janitors in their 70s, still cafeteria workers who skipped meals, still policymakers who called dignity too expensive. Jasmine knew the battle was far from finished, but the silence had been broken. The flame had been lit. Once a flame catches in dry wood, it spreads farther than anyone expects. Meanwhile, Mr. Trailer discovered a new rhythm. He joined church services more regularly. He mentored young men on his block. Occasionally, he spoke at schools. At first, he was shy, unsure what to say, but soon he realized that his plain, unpolished words carried more weight than any politician's speech. Do not let the world tell you you're small. He told one group of students, small things build big things. Small acts build whole lives. I was just a man with a mop, but even a mop can shine light if you carry it with love. The students listened, some distracted, some leaning forward, but all hearing something they might carry for years. When Jasmine visited again, he told her about these talks. She laughed warmly. See, you thought retirement meant fading away, but you're still giving. You always will. He laughed too. Maybe so, but at least now I can do it sitting down. The two sat in the quiet Louisiana dusk, laughter mingling with the cicadas. For Jasmine, the fight would go on in hearings, rallies, and endless debates, but she carried with her something enduring. The memory of a man who once poured her lukewarm tea and taught her that dignity was not earned, but inherent. For Mr. Trailer, life slowed at last. The days were gentler, the nights quieter, yet in rest, he discovered something unexpected. Recognition, not for what he had done, but for who he had always been. And for the nation, his story became a warning and a promise. Justice is not a gift. Dignity is not optional. Recognition is not charity. They are rights, and rights delayed are rights denied. As the sun set over Shreveport, casting long golden light across his porch, Mr. Leonard Trailer rocked slowly in his chair, at peace. And somewhere, quietly but surely, the world shifted toward the justice he had always deserved. Stories do not end when the camera fades, nor when the headlines move on. They linger in quiet ways, in the choices we make, in the lives we touch, in the questions that remain after the applause. The story of Leonard Trailer, the janitor who gave his life to Clara Barton High School, is one such story. It is not merely about one man retiring after 52 years of labor. It is about dignity reclaimed, justice demanded, and love made visible. For Jasmine Crockett, what began as a journey back to her old school became something larger. She did not expect that a quiet conversation in a dim hallway with an aging custodian would set off a movement. Yet the truth has a way of breaking through, even when buried beneath decades of silence. Her decision to act, to say enough, transformed one man's future and awakened a nation's conscience. The lessons are many, First, that no work is invisible except by design. The janitor, the bus driver, the cafeteria worker. These are the hands that keep schools alive. Though rarely acknowledged, Leonard Traylor embodied that truth. Every mop stroke, every lunch ticket slipped into a child's hand. Every quiet word of encouragement was an act of service as noble as any speech delivered in Congress. His life reminds us that justice must begin with those who have been most forgotten. Second, that recognition is not charity. Too often, society treats respect as if it were a gift to be granted rather than a right to be honored. But as Jasmine made clear, supporting Mr. Traylor was never about pity. It was about justice. It was about restoring what had always been his: the right to rest, the right to be seen, the right to be valued. Third, that small acts can ripple into great change. A lukewarm cup of tea slipped into a weary teenager's locker decades ago became the seed of a movement. A photograph of a janitor sweeping in the background of a hallway became a symbol of dignity. A fundraiser begun with a few clicks became a national conversation. History is rarely shaped by grand gestures alone. More often, it is reshaped by the ordinary kindnesses that refuse to die. For African American elders, this story resonates with a lifetime of memory. They know what it means to work until their bodies ache, to sacrifice so that others may rise, to give and never be thanked. Leonard Traylor became a mirror, reflecting their struggles and their triumphs. His retirement, secured at last, became a collective victory. It was a whisper to every grandmother who scrubbed floors, every father who worked double shifts, every unseen worker. You matter. And we see you now. But the conclusion of this story is not a final chapter. It is an invitation to ask, who in our lives remains unseen, who keeps the world turning quietly, without applause, without recognition. And what will we do to ensure their dignity is not postponed until death? When Mr. Traylor rocked on his porch in Shreveport, finally free. The world did not change overnight, but it shifted, however slightly, towards justice. His name may never appear in textbooks alongside presidents or generals, yet, in the lives of students, in the halls of schools, in the voices of those who now demand fairness, his legacy lives. And that is the point. True legacies are not measured in monuments, but in memory. They are not carved into marble, but into the hearts of those who carry them forward. As we close this story, remember this: justice is not charity, dignity is not optional, and recognition is not a luxury. They are rights. Rights worth fighting for. Rights worth living for. Leonard Traylor's life reminds us that the quietest heroes often hold the loudest truths. So let us honor him, not only with words, but with action. Let us look for the unseen in our schools, our communities, our families. Let us lift them up, not once, but always. And in doing so, let us build a world where no one who gives their life in service is ever forgotten. Because sometimes giving someone back their dignity is not just a good deed. It is justice. And justice, once awakened, refuses to sleep again.